Police say a report that led to a SWAT team response in Louisville yesterday turned out to be a hoax. The homeowner says he was in the shower getting ready for work.
Hollywood legends aren't supposed to be vulnerable. They're larger-than-life, untouchable icons who exist in our collective imagination as much as in reality. But on a quiet Sunday morning in 2015, Clint Eastwood found himself in a situation no amount of squinting or tough guy dialogue could solve. The sun had barely risen over his Carmel, California estate when the peace was shattered by the unmistakable sound of police sirens. Not just one or two patrol cars, but a full tactical response team, complete with armored vehicles, helicopters circling overhead, and officers in full combat gear. Neighbors peered through windows as the sleepy, upscale community transformed into what looked like a war zone. The target, the sprawling ranch-style home of the then 85-year-old filmmaker and former mayor of Carmel. Eastwood, who had been enjoying his morning coffee and newspaper, found himself staring down the barrels of multiple weapons as officers ordered him to exit his home with his hands visible. For a man who had spent decades playing characters on both sides of the law, the irony wasn't lost on him. "I've been in this business long enough to know when something doesn't feel right," Eastwood later told reporters, and this definitely didn't feel like a regular Sunday morning. What Eastwood had become was the highest-profile victim of swatting, the dangerous prank where someone makes a false emergency call to trigger a massive police response at an innocent person's address. It's named after the SWAT teams that typically respond to such calls, and it had already targeted celebrities like Justin Bieber, Ashton Kutcher, and Tom Cruise. But Eastwood wasn't just any celebrity. He was a cultural institution, a man who had defined American masculinity for generations through roles in films like Dirty Harry, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, and Unforgiven. He was also a former public servant who had served as mayor of Carmel from 1986 to 1988. The call that triggered the response claimed there were multiple armed intruders at Eastwood's property, with shots fired and hostages taken. The caller, using technology to disguise their voice and location, provided enough specific details about Eastwood's home to make the threat credible. Law enforcement had no choice but to respond with full force. In the age of mass shootings and high-profile home invasions, they couldn't risk assuming it was a hoax. "When we get a call like that, we have to treat it as real until proven otherwise," explained Monterey County Sheriff Steve Bernal. "The safety of potential victims is our primary concern." As officers secured the perimeter and prepared for a potential hostage situation, Eastwood emerged from his home, confused but remarkably calm. Dressed in a simple t-shirt and jeans, he looked more like a regular octogenarian than the Hollywood tough guy millions knew from the silver screen. "I'm not sure what's going on here," he reportedly told the officers, "but I can assure you, I'm the only one home, and I haven't fired a gun outside of a movie set in years." The officers, many of whom had grown up watching Eastwood's films, found themselves in the surreal position of having to clear and secure Dirty Harry's house. Some later admitted to feeling a strange mix of professional duty and starstruck awe as they moved through the legendary director's home. What they found inside wasn't what anyone expected, especially those who only knew Eastwood through his on-screen personas. Instead of the arsenal of weapons one might expect from a man who had built his career playing gunslingers and cops, officers discovered a surprisingly modest living space filled with musical instruments, art supplies, and stacks of books on history, film, and jazz. In one room, a half-finished painting stood on an easel, a landscape of the Carmel coastline that Eastwood had been working on for weeks. In another, a piano with sheet music open to a complex jazz composition that the actor had been teaching himself to play. "It was like walking through a completely different person's life than the one we thought we knew," one officer later commented. "This wasn't Dirty Harry's house. This was the home of an artist." Perhaps most surprising was Eastwood's extensive collection of meditation books and Buddhist philosophy texts, carefully arranged in a small study where a yoga mat was rolled out facing the morning sun. For a man known for playing characters who solved problems with their fists or firearms, the revelation that he started each day with meditation and stretching came as a shock to many. As the officers completed their sweep and confirmed there was no threat, the tension began to dissolve. Eastwood, rather than being angry about the intrusion, invited the officers to stay for coffee. "He was incredibly gracious," Sheriff Bernal recalled. "He understood we were just doing our job, and he actually seemed more concerned about us than about the disruption to his morning." Over coffee, served on his back porch overlooking the Pacific Ocean, Eastwood shared stories from his decades in Hollywood with the officers. He talked about his transition from actor to director, his love for Carmel, and his concerns about the increasing divisiveness in American politics. He wasn't lecturing or grandstanding, one officer said. He was just talking like a regular person who's seen a lot of life and has some perspective on things. The conversation took an unexpected turn when Eastwood revealed his own history with law enforcement. Few of the officers knew that before becoming an actor, a young Clint had been drafted into the U.S. Army in 1951 and later worked as a lifeguard and swimming instructor at Fort Ord, just a few miles from where they were sitting. "I've always had tremendous respect for what you folks do," Eastwood told them. "Putting your lives on the line for strangers, that's real heroism. What I did in movies was just pretend." As the impromptu gathering wound down and the officers prepared to leave, Eastwood had one request: that they keep what they saw in his home private. Not because he was embarrassed by his interests in art, music, and meditation, but because he valued his privacy and the separation between his public persona and his personal life. The officers agreed, and for several years, the details of what they discovered remained largely unknown. The incident itself made headlines: Clint Eastwood, latest celebrity swatting victim. But the revelations about the man behind the myth stayed mostly private. The perpetrator of the swatting was eventually identified as a teenager from Illinois who had targeted multiple celebrities as part of an online community that treated such dangerous pranks as a game. When asked why he chose Eastwood, the teen's answer was revealing: because he's supposed to be the toughest guy in Hollywood. I wanted to see if he really was. The irony wasn't lost on Eastwood, who declined to press charges against the teen, but did agree to speak with him via video call as part of a restorative justice program. "I told him that real toughness isn't about guns or fighting," Eastwood later shared. "It's about taking responsibility for your actions and having the courage to face consequences." The swatting incident, while frightening and disruptive, ultimately revealed something important about one of America's most enduring cultural icons. Behind the squint and the steely gaze was a man of surprising depth and complexity. An artist, a musician, a seeker of wisdom, who had spent decades crafting a public image that was only one facet of his true self. "People think they know you because they've seen you in movies," Eastwood reflected years later. "But that's not you they're seeing. That's a character, a creation. The real person is always more complicated, more contradictory, and hopefully more interesting." For the officers who responded to that false alarm in 2015, the experience changed how they viewed not just Clint Eastwood, but celebrity culture in general. The gap between public perception and private reality had never been more apparent. "I went in there expecting to meet Dirty Harry," one officer admitted. "Instead, I met a thoughtful 85-year-old man who paints landscapes and practices meditation. It was a good reminder not to confuse the role with the person." As for Eastwood himself, he took the incident in stride, even incorporating elements of it into a film he directed years later. When asked if the experience had left him shaken or angry, his response was characteristically understated. "At my age, you learn to roll with the punches. Besides, it makes for a pretty good story. Not as good as the ones I get to tell on film, but not bad for a Sunday morning in Carmel." The swatting incident, while intended as a malicious prank, inadvertently pulled back the curtain on the real Clint Eastwood. Not the gunslinger or the tough cop or the grizzled veteran, but the artist, the thinker, the man who had spent a lifetime creating iconic characters while keeping his true self largely private. In the end, what officers found in Eastwood's home that morning wasn't scandalous or shocking in the way the prankster might have hoped. What they found was something far more surprising: humanity, complexity, and depth behind one of cinema's most iconic facades. And perhaps that's the most valuable lesson from this strange incident, that behind every myth, every legend, every larger-than-life persona, there's a real person with interests, passions, and dimensions that no movie screen could ever fully capture. As Eastwood himself once said in a rare moment of personal reflection, "The biggest journey in life is inward." For a man who spent decades projecting strength outward, that journey had clearly led him to places few of his fans could have imagined. Places that were accidentally revealed when a prank call brought armed officers to his door on what should have been just another quiet Sunday morning in Carmel.